Zevachim is Daf Tzadi Zayin, 97, and hopefully everyone's at the Mishnah, 3 lines from the bottom of Tzadi Vav Amud Bet, which is a very reasonable place to be. Right, so again, to remind everyone, this week has been an unusual week because we talked about a halacha that is very not, people don't think about this a lot. I'd say most people don't spend a lot of time thinking about what to do with the blood of a chatat that sprinkles onto your clothing. But of course, if you were a Kohen, it was a very frequent event, right? Because blood was everywhere. And they had to really deal with this, as we've seen the last few days. Rabbi Tarfon adds a very interesting detail today. So yesterday we were talking about the pots, right? If you cook a chatat in a pot, then you have to do something with that pot afterwards because it retains the influence of the karban. And after 24 hours or one day and one night, it becomes notar, right? And so you can't use it anymore. So you have to clean it out. We talked about that a lot in the last few days. Rabbi Tarfon says something very interesting. Rabbi Tarfon Omer in the Mishnah, on the bottom of Tzadi Vav Amud Bet, Bishal b'tchilat haregel, if you cook in the pot with kachim at the beginning of the holiday, yivashel bo kol haregel. You can keep cooking on it the entire holiday. Sounds very strange. Like why, right? Why don't you have to clean it out after a chatas is 1 day and 1 night? A shlamim is 2 days and 1 night, but that's the regel is 7 days, right? So we don't know yet. Chachamim omrim ad zman achila, which seems pretty reasonable to us until the time that you're allowed to eat from that karban, right? So if a karban is edible for Sunday and Sunday night, you can use, meaning let's say you cook a karban chatat in it on Sunday, you could then use the pot a second time the same day, which makes sense. You don't have to wash it out after every use, right? And of course you could clean it, but you don't have to wash it out with marika and shtifa between every use, but you have to wash it out once you get to the zman achila. Continues the Mishnah, Marika Shtifa, what is Marika and Shtifa? We keep using this description. Says the Mishnah, Marika is Marikata kos. It's like washing a cup, which means washing the inside. Ushtifa is kishtifata kos. It's like rinsing the outside of the cup. So you have to wash the inside of the pot and the outside of the pot. Again, this has nothing to do with cleanliness, right? It could be clean or not clean. It has to do with taking out this sort of symbolic spirit or flavor, maybe, or taste of the karban. And continues the Mishnah, Marika Shtifa b'tzonein. They're both with cold water. It's not done necessarily with hot water, but we'll see in the Gemara there's machlokes about that, but that's the opinion of the Mishnah. However, hashbud va'askala, I don't know how to translate these things, but I mean, shbud means a spit. Askala is another thing like that. A skewer. Thank you, Nava. Which are things that you actually cook directly on the fire. So those need a higher level of cleaning, and you have to magilan b'chamin, you have to put them into hot water. Rashi points out that it seems in the Gemara Avodah Zarah asks, why don't you have to do what we call libun, which is where you put a blowtorch, hot water right on it, but obviously not our sugya. Now says the Gemara, my time.
Torah translates it as grill.
Grill, okay. Same, but again, the meaning is that
same idea.
Same on it, right? As opposed to a pot, which where the fire heats up the pot, which has the food inside of it, right? My time at Rabbi Tarfon. What's the reason for Rabbi Tarfon, who says that you can basically keep cooking in the pot the whole regel, the whole holiday? Says Rabbi Tarfon something very interesting. Damar Kra, because the pasuk says the shita here adds Rabbi Yitzchak. Damar Kra, the pasuk says Ufanita baboker v'halachta olecha. Right, it's talking about when you go up to the Shalosh Regalim, you go to Hashem in the Beit HaMikdash. Get up in the morning and go back to your tent. Now, of course, you don't travel on Chag, right? So when we say get up in the morning and go back to your tent, it doesn't mean the morning of Yom Tov. It means Isru Chag, right? After the holiday. But it's calling it Boker, right? Why is it calling it Boker? Because HaKatuv asa likulan Boker echad. The Torah has basically said that the whole holiday is one period, and the day after the holiday is the next morning. So essentially, in some metaphorical terms, we're looking at the entire Chag as one day. And so since basically 1 day is the Zman for a Chatat, you can cook the whole Chag. Says Gemara, 1 second. Really? The whole Chag is 1 day? Then you shouldn't be an Isser of Notar, right? Because you could say, my Chatat is 4 days old, but it's 1 day because it's the holiday. Matkifla, where am I? Matkifla Rachtavai Barami, B'chi ein pigol beregel, vein notar beregel. You're going to say that there's no pigol, right? And if you have a machshava, I'm shechting this animal on the 2nd day of Sukkot to eat it on the 5th day, right? That's pigol. But or notar, you have a shlamim, you save it over for 5 days later. There's no such thing as pigol and notar and regel because it's all 1 day, right? 2nd day of the Chag, the 5th day of the Chag is the same day. The 5th day Malchinami, maybe that is true. Maybe question all the assumptions you thought you knew. Tanya, but in fact, there's a Braita which tells you that's a mistake. I mean, Natan Omer Lo Amar Rabbi Tarfon Elazu Bilvad. Rabbi Tarfon's limit is limited to washing out the pots. It has no other implication, right? And if it's based on a pasuk of Panita Baboker, it should imply that the whole Chag is one Boker. Ella says, Kid Rav Nachman Amar Rabba Ravua. In fact, the source of Rabbi Tarfon is based on what Rav Nachman said in the name of Rabba Bar Ravua. Damar Rav Nachman Amar Rabba Bar Ravua. Kol Yom V'Yom Naseh Gi'ul L'Chavero. Which is a fascinating concept. That every day becomes the cleaning, the Gi'ul's Hagalah, for the next day. Meaning, because the Regel is so busy, right? Thousands of people would come to the Beit HaMikdash. So they would bring their Karban Chatat, which you could bring on the Chol HaMoed or not a Yom Tiv. They would bring a Shlamim, which you could bring, every day at Chol HaMoed. There'd be tons and tons of Karbanot. So the pots were in constant use, right? And so every time you cooked your Karban Chatat in this pot, 20 minutes later or an hour later, they went and got the pot and they cooked the Shlamim in it. But when you cook the Shlamim, you basically take out the taste of the Chatat and put in the taste of Shlamim. And so now it's a Shlamim and it's good for 2 days. But then the next morning, you do a Karban Chatat again. So then it's good for a day. So each time the next cooking becomes the cleaning of the previous cooking. And so basically, as long as the pot remains in constant use, right, it's going to be fine as long as the Shlamim is last. Because remember, the problem with the Chatat is that it's a day and a night. So if the last thing you cooked in it was a Chatat and then the morning came, you'd have to wash it. But because shlamim are obviously much more numerous than chatot, right? Because you bring a shlamim for fun, a chatat is done for a major sin. So we assume that even if you cook a karban chatat in a pot, later in that day, someone's going to cook a shlamim in it. And therefore, the whole regel, you don't have to wash it out because the cooking cleans it up. And the truth is, it's not limited to the regel. This could be true every day of the year, just it's not common, right? Because usually during the year, they use the pots infrequently. And so when you did a chatat, you assume no one's going to use it again. But there is a concept of gi'ul lechavero, which is a fascinating concept. Continues the Mishnah.
Is this a rabbinic concept rather than a Haraita concept? Because it seems a little weird.
No. The concept is that this is our halacha too, right? If you cook, say, something chametz in a pot, right? Then you heat. The rule is always kibol kach polto, right? The way it absorbed it is the way it gives it up. So if you do the same thing in the pot with not chametz, it's considered the chametz left the pot, right? Like you heat it up with chametz, it's chametz. You heat it up with non-chametz, it becomes non-chametz. So it's the same thing with a shlamim and an asham and a chatas, that whatever the second thing is, it becomes that thing. And as long as that's a shlamim, so again, the point is, if it's a shlamim, then you can do it from Sunday till Monday. But then if on Monday morning you cook another karban in it, then it takes over the new karban. It always takes the status of the last thing. And that's how we paskin. It's just obviously we don't rely on this for we don't.
I was going to say I've never heard of being able to cashier a pot Pesach that way.
Well, Pesach we do that, but the problem is, of course, if you have meat in a pot and then you put dairy in the pot, well, the dairy takes out the meat, but it makes it treif, right? So that's the problem. So for example, but the way you kasher on Pesach is you take a pot that was chametz, you heat it up with boiling hot water, and then you put a stone in so that it goes over. But basically, you're just putting hot water, boiling it, and that's how you kasher it. It's the same thing. In the Beit HaMikdash, it happened to have meat of a shlamim in that pot, but the meat of the shlamim takes out the status of the chatat. Now, again, the other point, which we're going to mention in the next Mishnah, is, of course, that shlamim has to be eaten like a chatat, right? Because since the shlamim was cooked in a pot that was a chatat, you have to then treat the shlamim like it has the taste of the chatat and only kohanim can eat it, or things like that, right? So that's a different halacha. But from a concept of washing, you don't have to wash it on the chak. That's Rabbi Tarfon. The Chachamim do not agree, but that's Rabbi Tarfon's opinion. Chachamim omrim ad zman achila, the 2 dots. My ka'amr. Now the Mishnah continued basically and said, right, till zman achila, and then it said merikas shtifa, which implied, we understood in the Mishnah, that you have to wash it out right away. So what do you mean? Is it till tomorrow, or do you have to wash it right away? What do you say? So Amar of Nachman, Amar Rabbi Ravua. I thought someone has a chesur mechasur here, but anyways, mamtin la ad zman achila. What the Chachamim are saying is you can't wash it out right away, but you wait until the zman achila, meaning if you cook the karban chatat, you wait till the next morning when you no longer can eat the chatat. The hadar avidle merika shtifa, and then you do merika shtifa. Minani. Now, how do we know what merika and shtifa are? Remember, our Mishnah said merika is on the inside, shtifa is on the outside. How do we know that? Amar Rabbi Yochanan misham Abba Yossi ben Abba. Because kativ, it says umurak v'shutaf b'mayim, right? But it says right afterwards, kativ kol zachar b'kohanim yochal. It says, we're learning this Chachamim's rule. It says the kohanim should eat from the karban. Haketzad. Well, what do you do? Do you wash it or do you eat it? What it's telling you is mamtin la zman achila, that you can wait and keep using the pot until the zman achila is up. V'hadra avalem rika shtifa, and then you wash it. Meaning these things don't contradict each other; they're complementary. So you do achila as long as you can eat it, and then you do mrika shtifa when that time is up. Which, according to the chachamim, if it's a karban chatat, would be the next morning, and if it's a shlamim, it would be the next evening. Continues the Gemara. We quote the Mishnah. Marika is kimrika takos. Marika means like washing the inside of a cup. Shtifa is kishtifa takos. Tana Rabbanan says the Braita. Marika ushtifa bitzonein, which is what our Mishnah said, right? Oh. That's what our Mishnah said. Yeah, they're both in cold water. So this is consistent with our Mishnah. Marika and shtifa bitzonein divrei Rebbe, which makes a lot of sense because Rebbe wrote the Mishnah, right? That says Rebbe. Chachamim omrim. Marika b'chamin, that marika is hot water. That the inside of the vessel, the inside of the pot, has to be washed with hot water.
Makes sense.
And shtifa is bitzonein. And the outside, you can rinse it with cold water. My time, Adrabanan, because midi dahavia giulei of de kochavim. That is, and we didn't, it's not our sugi here, we learned this in Avodah Zarah, when the Torah talks about Midyan, remember the Kli Midyan, which they had to kasher. Remember, they fought war with Midyan. They came back with all these kelim, which were used for avodah zarah. So they had to break the ones that were cheres, of course, but the ones that you could clean that as it was shutaf b'mayim, you were able to clean that way, and that's the halacha. That in order to get the iser tam out of a pot, you have to use hot water. Says Rebbe says you're making a big mistake. Rebbe Amar Lecha, you're confusing what's going on here, because hagala lo ka'amina. I'm not disagreeing with you that you need to do hagala. Hagala is what we generally do when we kasher kelim, right? You put hot water in, you heat it up. Again, the way it was used, which is with heat because it's a pot, is the way you clean it. That you have to do to get the taste and the tam of the chatat out of the pot. You have to do hagala. But the issue of marika and shtifa is additional to that. It's a separate washing outside of taking out the taste. So even once you take out the taste, there is a sort of, I call it ceremonial, but it's halachic washing that has to happen that's not similar to kashering something for Pesach or for Avodah Zarah. So let me treat that inside. Rabbi Amar Lecha Hagala lo kamina. I'm not talking about doing Hagala. Ki kamina lemarika ushtifa debater Hagala. Right? I'm talking about the marika and shtifa you have to do after the Hagala. And says Rebbe, in that case, you just need cold water. You already took the taste of the chatat out of it by boiling it up. Now you've got to do this marika and shtifa. So that's a really good point. The Rabbanan, what do they say? They say, you're right. Logically, what you said, Rabbi, makes sense. But the pasuk says, umurak v'shutaf. Use two different verbs, right? Marika and shtifa. If you were right that they were the same, im kain, lichtov kra, o murak, o shutaf, shutaf, which of course sounds a little funny, but it could have used the same verb for both descriptions. Why does it say, my umurak ushutaf? Shmamina, Mrika Bechamin, Shtifa Betzonein. You see that they're different things. That one is hot water and one is cold water. And obviously, logically, as Nava thought it made sense, the inside would be hot and the outside would be cold. Rebbe, what would Rebbe answer to that? Because remember, Rebbe disagrees and says it's all cold. Rebbe says, Ich div murak, or shutaf. Have amina, I would have thought, no, it just means do it twice, right? Rinse it out twice, which you could imagine, like you rinse your hands twice, right? Have amina, trezimni murak, or trezimni shutaf. Lekach div murak v'shutaf lomar lecha, to tell you that it means the inside and the outside. Marika is k'mrikat hakos, like rinsing out the inside of a cup, and shtifa is k'shtifat hakos, like pouring on the outside of the cup. So that is the machloket Rebbe. Our Mishnah, of course, which is usually the halacha, goes like Rebbe, that it's both with cold water, and the chachamim said hot and cold. Okay, straightforward. See, I told you got easier. The next Mishnah continues now in the middle of Daf Tzadi Zayin Amud Aleph, what we just mentioned, which is bishelbo kachim v'chulin. Let's say you cook in a pot in the Beit HaMikdash kachim and chulin, right? So the kohanim come and they have meat in a pot, right, from a karban, but they want to add some potatoes, right, or some barley and make a nice challah or whatever they had, right? So they cook together kachim and chulin in that pot. Or kachim kadashim and kachim kalim, where they cook together meat from a shlamim and meat from a chatat. So they mix different karbanot. So obviously you would say it goes with the stricter one, but that's not always true. It depends on the old standby we have called notein tala. It has to give taste, meaning let's say the whole pot is shlamim and you put a little bit of meat from a chatat in. If it is an insignificant taste, then you don't have to worry about it, then it's batel. But im yesh bohem benotein tam, if it gives a taste, meaning the kachim or the kachim kadashim in that case give a taste. Harei kalim nechalim kichamurim. Then the lighter ones have to be eaten like the stricter ones. Shebehen. Ve'inan tu'unim rikao shtifa. Now this makes no sense, right? Because it sounds like you don't need to wash out the pot, but why don't you need to wash out the pot? You just said if the chatat flavor, you treat it like a chatat, well, then you should have to wash it out. And ve'enam poslim b'maga, and if it's pasul, right? Remember what we'll see, and we quote the pasuk in a minute. But remember, we said by karban chatat that's pasul. Kol asher yiga b'hem yikdash. Anything that touches it becomes holy or prohibited, like it. But this does not become that. Let's say you had a whole pot of shlamim, you put a little bit of chatat in there, but it doesn't enough to give taste. Then it doesn't make it pasul, right? Now, what I just said is true, but it's not what the Mishnah says, right? What the Mishnah just said is if you do enough for it to give taste, it doesn't make it pasul, which makes no sense. And the Gemara is going to change it to what I just said. But what the Mishnah seems to be saying is that even though it's notein dam, it doesn't make it pasul b'maga, which makes no sense, right? So the Gemara will explain that. Now, finally, says the Mishnah, what if it's like a dough, right? Or a rakik, I translate rakik like flatbread, right? Like a cracker. Miriam's got a word.
Wafer.
Wafer, that is a good word. So if you have a wafer, which remember from the shlamim, not shlam, the minachot, you would make a rakik, right? So you can have a rakik of a mincha, and you can have a rakik that you brought from home, right? Let's say it's not kudshim. So if you have a rakik, shnagabi rakik, so one rakik touched another, and some of the flavor, or the taste, or the juice of it, I don't know juice, but the flavor of it went on to the other one, or chaticha b'chaticha, one piece of meat touches another piece of meat, then it becomes pasul, meaning if it gives tam, it's the same principle. If it's notein tam, then it becomes prohibited because let's say the rakik is a mincha and the other rakik is your breakfast wafer, right? Yeah. So then the mincha, if it gives taste, again, it has to, now if it just touches it and they're dry, it's not giving taste. But let's say there's juice on the outside of it, or it's, cooked together, let's say, and it gives taste to it, it makes it kodesh like the holier one. But says the Mishnah, but one detail, lo kol harikikim v'lo kol chatichot asurim. It's not that the whole piece and the whole piece of meat or the whole piece of wafer becomes aser, eno oser el b'makom shebala. It's only the place that actually absorbed the taste of the other one. So meaning, let's say you have, a lot of meat together and you put in a pan a piece of meat that's chatas, that touches the other meat, it will make it pasul, but only the part that's touching it that actually absorbed the fat, right? And not the other part. Rashi, we'll see later, Rashi says, for example, like you take the fat, you render fat from a karban chatat, for example, right? And so you have like a little jar of fat that's from a karban chatat, and you smear your steak with it, right? So then, of course, that's notein tam, because it gives taste to it. But let's say you smear half the steak with it, you only have to cut off that half of the steak. Let's just say, okay? We'll see this in the Gemara. Says the Gemara, though, of course, my kamar. The Mishnah itself makes no sense, because the Mishnah started off by saying that if it's notein tam, it makes it like the more chamor. And then it said, but it doesn't need marika shtifa, and it doesn't become asur. I don't get it. If it's notein tam, why isn't it asur? Answers the Gemara, and there's different girsot here. On the right, I have someone, I don't know who, it says the Bartanura in mine, but my ka'amar, chesuri mechasur. They're missing words. The Bach does not have that missing words part, right? The Bach has a different version. It says hachi ka'amar. Either way, we're missing some words in the Mishnah, or we have to read some extra words into the Mishnah. V'hachi katani. Im yesh b'hem b'notein tam. If there is taste that's given from the kalim, from the chamurim to the kalim, then harei kalim techalim ki chamurim. Then the lighter things, let's say the shlamim in this case, are eaten like the chamurim. But utunim rikao shtifa, and they need to be washed out like a karban chatat, uposlim b'maga, and they become pasul by touching them like any pasul chatat. But however, and that's the first part of the Mishnah, continues the Mishnah, ein bahem benotein tam, so this is what's missing in the Mishnah, but what we're adding, if there is no taste being given by the extra thing, by the karban chatat, meaning it's a minuscule amount, then eina kalim nechalin kechamurim, then you don't have to eat the kalin, the shlamim, like the chamor. Ve'ein tunim rika shtifa, ve'ein poslim b'maga. Okay, so that basically is what the Mishnah is saying, two cases. There's a case where it gives taste, in which case it gets all the limits of the more chamor thing, and a case where it doesn't give taste. Says the Gemara, one second. Why do you say that you don't need to do marika and shtifa? Remember, you have a chatas and a shlamim here. So we're saying if the karban chatas doesn't give taste to the shlamim, you don't have to treat it like a chatat. But if you don't treat it like a chatat, does not mean that if it's pasul, doesn't become prohibited, right? Nihi tekache kadashim lobo, bekachim kalam liboi. Why don't you treat it like kachim kalam, which also need to get washed out, Why don't you do Marika and Shtifa? Because it's a shlamim. Answers Abaya, you're right. When we say Ein Tu'unim Dekamar, it means Kikachim Kachim. It means you don't have to do it that night, for example. Avol Kachim Kalim Tu'unim, of course, you have to treat it like Kachim Kalim. We don't mean you don't do any Marika or Shtifa. We mean you don't do Marika and Shtifa like the more Chamor one. That's a little bit weak. Rava says, I disagree. And in fact, our Mishnah is telling you something very important, which is that there's a machloket we had before, whether you do Marika and Shtifa only by a Chatat or also by a Shlamim. And our Mishnah is coming to tell you, you don't do it by a Shlamim. So we're basically saying a Stam Mishnah, like the Tana, who says you don't do it for a Kachim Kalim. And that's a big Kiddush, because it's a machloket. So Rava says, Hamani Rabbi Shimon. Our Mishnah, in fact, is Rabbi Shimon. The Amar, we had, Masoret Hashas gives you 3 sources in the last 3 days where we had this. The Amar Kachim Kalim Ein Tunim Rika Shtifa. That Rabbi Shimon holds, Kachim Kalim do not mean Rika and Shtifa. Says the Gemara, that's Bishlam the Rava, who explained our Mishnah to say that it's literal, that you don't do Marika and Shtifa. Now, our Mishnah makes a lot more sense why you have 2 cases in the Mishnah of Kachim mixing with Kachim Kalim and Kachim mixing with Chulin, right? Because the Chiddush is that even though it's Kachim mixing with Kachim Kalim, don't do Marika and Shtifa because it's like Rabbi Shimon. But according to Abaya, that all it's telling you in the Mishnah is if it gives taste, be the more Chamor. If it doesn't give a taste, be the more Kal, then why you have 2 cases? They're the same thing. So Bishma the Rava, Hanadiktani, O Kache Kadashim, O Kachim Kalim, they add words. The Chita adds Kachim, Diktani Kachim V'chulin as one case, O Kache Kadashim and Kachim Kalim is the second case. It should be the other order, but anyways. El Abaya Tarti Lamali. According to Abaya, why do you have 2 cases in our Mishnah? Right? Why are you telling me the exact same halacha twice, that if you have a stricter thing and a lighter thing, if it gives taste, it goes with the stricter, and if it doesn't, it goes with the lighter. It's the same halacha? Answers the Gemara Tzricha. According to Abaya, we would explain you need both cases in the Mishnah. Itana kachim v'chulim. If the Mishnah said kachim and chulim, I would have thought hava amina chulin hu d'mevatli kachim. Right? I understand if you have a big pot of chulin and a little bit of shlamim falls into it. If the shlamim does not give any taste, it's as if it's nothing. Why is it batel? Because they're different types. Because one is carbon and one is not carbon. And remember, as you recall, and we're going to have this much more in chulin, it's much easier to mevatel something that's different than something that's the same. So min bimino, remember, is never batel. But min shbisheino mino is batel. So this is kachim and chulin, it's batel. I get that. But lav minayo, it's not the same min. It's not the same species. Now, of course, it's the same meat, but it's not the same halachic thing. Avo kachi kachim and kachim kalim emalo, maybe they're not batel. And maybe even a small amount of chatas would be oser the whole shlamim. Itana kachi kachim kachim kalim. Now, if you just said that case of kachi kachim and kachim kalim, havamina, well, 1 second. Maybe the reason that a chatas into a shlamim becomes batel is because a shlamim at least is a karban. Hakachim hu da'alima livatuli kachim. A shlamim is strong enough, alima means strong, to mivatel another karban. Avachulin emalo. Maybe chulin has no status whatsoever. It's like the last people to board on the plane, right? So the chulin is not batel even from anything tzricha, and therefore you need to have both. Okay, you can tell what's on my mind. Anyways, continues the Mishnah. Rekik shenagia hagia birakik. If you have a wafer that's kachim that touches another wafer that's not. Tanra b'nei kol sheyiga. Right? The pasuk says by carbon chatat. Anything that it touches, if the carbon chatat is pasul, anything it touches, yikdash, becomes kodesh or holy. So it says kol sheyiga. Now, yigat means you touch. Yachla afilun shelo bala. You might think it means touch even if there's no taste or flavor that's transmitted. Talmud biv sara. It says anything that touches the meat, implying that there's got to be some meat there, right? Aji yivla bib sara, until it touches the actual meat and it absorbs some of the flavor. So you might have thought then, Yachol nagabe miktzat chaticha ye kulo pasul, that if one part of the piece, if one slice of the steak, not slice, one of the sides of the steak touches the karban chatat, the whole thing becomes pasul. That's why it said yiga, right? It said yiga to tell you hanogea pasul, only the part that touched. So it has to give off taste and it has to touch it. So you need both, right? Haketzad. Chotech et makom shabala, period. You cut off the place that absorbed it. Now the other drasha we make is biv sara, to tell you the meat, the lo begidin, the lo ba'atzamot, lo b'kanayim, lo b'tzlafayim, not parts of the animal that don't give off a taste, like gidim, which are the sinews, right, which don't have taste, right, and the atzamot, the bones, and the karnayim, which are the horns, the tzlafayim, which are the hooves, right. So those parts of the animal, which unfortunately is what they make into hot dogs, right? But those parts are not giving off any taste, and therefore they don't passel. Now it says yikdash. What does the word yikdash mean? Right? It says kol asher yiga bivsara yikdash. What does yikdash mean? Liot kimota. It's like the thing that it touched, right? Meaning a ketzad im psula. If the karban chatat that touched it is pasul, he tifsal. It's pasul. Dim kshera. Now if the chatat that touched it was a kosher chatat, then it gives off its status as a karban chatat. Meaning, where am I? You eat like the more chamor of the karbanot. If one is a chatat and one is a shlamim, you do like the chatat. I asked the Gemara a beautiful question, which is, let's say you have a karban shlamim. You shechted on Sunday, which means you can eat it all day Sunday, Sunday night, and Monday. It then gets by mistakenly cooked in a pot with a karban chatat. The karban chatat makes it kodesh, meaning kol asher yiga bivsara yikdash. So the chatat touched the shlamim, it gave off some flavor to it, it makes it like a karban chatat. And now you have to be yikdash, which we think means a lotas. Rashi quotes the lotase, that you treat it like a chatat. You're not allowed to eat a chatat after the next day. So Monday morning comes and you have this beautiful piece of meat, and the Kohen says you don't eat it because it's yikdash. It's like a karban chatat. But why don't you counter and say, but I have a mitzvah aseh to eat my karban shlamim? And why isn't the aseh of eating the shlamim docha the lo taseh of not eating the karban chatat? Right? So even if
you think that it keeps transferring.
No, but even that's the pot. But even if you treat it like a chatat, you have an aseh to eat a shlamim and a lo taseh not to eat a karban chatat. So why don't you say, ask the Gemara, beautiful question, amai, where am I? V'neti aseh v'litchiet lo taseh. Why doesn't the aseh of eating the shlamim be docha the lo taseh of not eating the karban chatat? Amar Rava, because we have a principle, and this is a super important principle, ein aseh dochel lo taseh shebemikdash. The principle of aseh dochel lo taseh is not true in the Beit HaMikdash. And I have a pasuk to prove that. Shenemar, because there's a pasuk by Karban Pesach. It says, ve'etzem lo tishberu bo. Don't break a bone of the Karban Pesach. And it says Rabbi Shimon ben Menashe, we had this in Masechet Pesachim many years ago, echad etzem sheyesh bo moch, ve'echad etzem she'ein bo moch. A bone that has marrow and a bone that doesn't have marrow. Amai. Why? There's a mitzvah to say to eat the karban pesach. You inside some of the bones of the animal, you have a lot of marrow. There's a ton of edible stuff. Why don't you break the bone, which is a lo taseh, right? Don't break a bone in order to eat the marrow. Clearly, you don't mevatel an aseh. An aseh is not mevatel lo taseh in the Beit HaMikdash. So you see from there, where am I? That's the principle. So that is Rava's answer. Rav Ashi says, no. There's an easier answer. It might be true what you said about Karban Pesach, but when you think about it, the word yikdash is also a aseh. It says, make the animal chol asher yiga bivsara yikdash, become a chatat and make it holy. So it's an aseh and a lo taseh. Treat it like a chatat in an active way and in a negative way. So therefore, it's an aseh and a lo taseh. Where my Rav Ashi Amar yikdash asehu, ve'ein aseh of eating the shlamim dochet lo taseh va'aseh. Okay, so that is the end of that small piece. Says the Gemara now with the third to last narrow line. Ashkechan chatat de mikadesh. It shouldn't be mitkadesh. Mikadesh bebalua. You found by a chatat, because it says in the Torah, kol asher yiga bivsara yikdash. So it says by chatat, whatever it touches becomes kodesh, right? But shar kachim minol. How do you know this applies to other karbanot? Amar Shmuel Mishum Rebbe Lazar, and we're going to darshan this for the rest of today and tomorrow. There's one pasuk that includes all the karbanot that compares them to each other. It says Zot HaTorah le'olah le'mincha le'chatat la'sham le'milim v'zevach hashlamim. There's 6 karbanot in that pasuk, and it's telling you that they're all the same. So whatever applies to one applies to the other. And now the Gemara says, let's take this opportunity to learn what 6 different karbanot teach all the other karbanot. We're only going to do 1 or 2 today, but we're about to get through all 6. Let's start with Ola because it's the first one in the pasuk. What does Ola tell you? By comparing an Ola to a Chatas and a Shlamim and a Shalmei Tzibur, Zevchei Shlamim and all the other things, an Asham and a Mincha and a Miluim, okay? Ki Ola. All karbanot are like an Ola. We're at the first wide line. Ma Ola tuna kli, afkol tuna kli. Just like an Ola needs a vessel, every karban needs a vessel. What do you mean a vessel? What vessel do you need for an Ola? My kli. Well, we think it means a mizrak. A mizrak means a kli to catch the blood in. So you can't just take the blood in your hands and put it on the mizbeach. You have to actually put it in a kli. But says the Gemara, you don't need to learn that from Ola, Because b'shalmei tzibur namichdev. It says it by shalmei tzibur, right? Buhu, because it says, and this is the original shalmei tzibur, meaning the karban that Moshe Rabbeinu brought on Har Sinai. It says, "Vayikach Moshe chatzi adam." Moshe took half of the blood from the karban, v'yasem ba'aganot. He put it in aganot. Aganot are pitchers, right? To pour on his bed, not to drink, right? So you see, Rashi says, I think it's Rashi, that the proof, that the point here is, why would you need Ola to teach you that? You can learn it from Shlomim. Use Shlomim to teach you that. Now, someone has to teach you that, but maybe it's Shlomim, not Ola. So it says, well, you're right. The chiddush of Ola is this sakin, is that you need a kli to kill the animal, right? You have to use a knife. You can't use like a stone. We had this before, right? And we'll have it in Tchulin. You can't use a stone, even have a very sharp stone. You can't use that. You have to use a designated knife to shech the animal. How do we know that? By an Ola? What's the source? The Ola Gufa Minal. And how do you know that by an Ola? Dichtiv be the first Ola by Avraham slaughtering his son Yitzchak as an Ola. Dichtiv, because it says, Vayishlach Avraham et Yado, Vayikach et Ma'achdelet. Avraham took his hand and took the knife, right? And Hatam Olahu. We know that Yitzchak was supposed to be an Ola. Dichtiv, because it says that he found the aisle, Vayaleh Ola Tachat Beno. So the Ola became his son. The aisle became the Ola instead of his son. And therefore, you know from that original source that a carbon Ola is done with a knife. And so the pasuk says Ola to tell you all other carbonot have to be shechted with a knife, not a mincha, but all other animals. Okay, let's do one more. 4 lines in the bottom, 5 lines in the bottom.
Oh,
right? Yeah, mincha because it's flour. Mincha, what do we learn from mincha to every other karban? That ma mincha ina nechel to l'zichrei kuna. Remember, every mincha, we talked about this before, is a kache kadashim. So minachot are not eaten by regular people, meaning the shiaria mincha, right? The Torah is different, but the regular mincha is eaten l'zichrei kuna. Afkol inam nechalim el l'zichrei kuna. All of these karbanot in the pasuk are kachi kadashim, chatas and an asham and a miluim and a ola. Well, ola is not eaten. The other ones are eaten only by zichrei kuna. Where am I? As it says Gemara, but Mahi, what's the point? What are you teaching us? The Torah says that a chatat and asham and dichtivbo kol zachar b'kohanim yochlenu. Shalmei tzibor. Now you're saying, oh, maybe the chiddush is that shalmei tzibor. Remember, shalmei tzibor were brought on atzeret, on Shavuot, the shnei kivsei atzeret, right? Or shalmei tzibor. So, but how do you know who eats those? The Torah never says who eats that karban. So maybe the pasuk is telling you, just like a mincha is eaten by zichrei kuna, shalmei tzibor eaten by zichrei kuna. Says Gemara, but we have another source for that. There's another pasuk that teaches you that, because the pasuk says by shalmei tzibor. That's actually not by shalmei tzibor. The pasuk is by Korach. It says when it's talking about karbanot in Parsha Korach, it says b'kadshei kadashim tuchlanu. You should eat these karbanot b'kadshei kadashim. Kol zachar yochaloto. And Tosas quotes that we have a Gemara. Tosas brings the Gemara from Erechin that we learn limed al shalmei tzibor she'en nechal al zichrei kuna. This actually is a source that shalmei tzibor can only be. This pasuk is referring to shalmei tzibor. He explains why. But why do you need the pasuk of zot haTorah le'olah le'mincha le'chatat la'asham le'mlim zevach hashlamim if you have another pasuk? Answers the Gemara Tinaihi. In fact, it's a machloket tanaim. There's two opinions. Top of daf tzadikhat ika denafkle mehacha. Some people learn it from this source, some people learn it from that source. It's a machloket tanaim. Tosas quotes a third source, another Gemara. So there's 3 sources of this, but basically one of the tanaim, the one we're quoting today, learns that halakha that zevchei shalmei tzibor in by zichrei kuna from this pasuk of Zot HaTorah. Tomorrow, God willing, at 7:45 a.m., we will learn the next words in the pasuk, which are chatat and asham, miluim, what we do from each other word in the pasuk, and we will see why it's relevant to our Gemara. Shukach, everyone. Again, Chodesh Tov, Chanukah Sameach, Shavua Tov.
Shavua Tov, Chanukah Sameach, Chodesh
See you tomorrow
Tov.
morning.
Hanukkah Sameach.
Thank you.
Good night.
Tomorrow morning,
7:45.
7:45. See you then.